Okay. Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So we were actually in the middle of a comment yesterday that actually started on the other page, on this page up here, right? And it talked about how if a father or a bet din did not see that the child was circumcised, the person himself had to make sure he was circumcised. And the reason why is that there's a punishment attached to not being circumcised, that punishment being karet. And so there's a discussion about that. And in fact, according to the Torah Temimah, but Maimonides' opinion, which is that he is not under this punishment of karet unless he dies uncircumcised, that if we're saying that that's when the punishment takes place, it must mean that he exists to endure that punishment. So here we go. We're going to do the best I can with this. The shiur would be the amount. Let me see where there we go. The amount, there we go. It's a very small cursor, I'm afraid. The shiur hagadlut, and the amount of greatness, I would say. We'll have to sort of just keep that as a place marker in a way, right? The inyan onesh karet, with regards to the issue of the punishment of karet. Bazeh lo nitba'er mefurash. Regarding, it is not explained here explicitly. Doesn't say what exactly this punishment is and to what extent, etc., etc. Omnam, however, b'makom echer, in another different place. In other words, here it doesn't define what this karet is, right? He says, but in a different place, matzinu, we find shebi'er harambam meforash, that the Rambam explains explicitly, deven yun gimel shana nikra gadol, that a person is considered an adult when he reaches, this is a male in this case, of course, when he reaches the age of 13. Gam le'inyan chiyuvei karet. There he says that even becoming, in other words, the issue is, are you punishable by karet? And Rambam is saying you're not punishable by karet until you die uncircumcised, right? But in another place he explains, right, that you do that the punishment of karet is imposed on you. It may not actually happen, but the point is you're going to be imposed with this particular punishment once you're above 13. V'hu beperek bet halacha yud, and it's in chapter 2, the 10th halacha, me ishut, right? This ishut means, it's hard for me to, in ish is a man, right? So maybe human relations, or what it is to be a human being. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to exactly translate that word. But tzarich iyun, and we're going to have to look, this requires further investigation. Lahashvot zeh, right? To equate this, imash de kaimalan, with what we have we have on record, so to speak. In other words, we have this tradition. She'ein beit din shel mala, that a court on high, that is to say, the heavenly court, me'anishin kodim isrim shana, that in fact they do not administer a punishment prior to arriving at 20 years, right? That's assuming that we mean that here, I'm not certain if it's saying, does it mean that you have to be 20 years old or whether you have to have done this for 20 years? My guess is that it's going to be 20 years old, that we have the contradiction between the Rambam statement that you're above 13 and above, and another statement that says that you have to be 20 years old to be liable or subject to the punishment of karet. That's what we're talking about. Kemivuar b'Shabbat, as is explained in Tractate Shabbat, page tet bet on, this is page 89b. Upiresh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought I knew what this was. Oh, Maybe Piresh HaMishnayot, right? La Rambam. That is to say, the Rambam wrote a commentary on, at a very early age, actually. I think he was under 20 when he wrote this commentary. I believe it's in Judeo-Arabic on the Mishnah. It's been translated into Hebrew. That's what I think we're talking about. Pei Zion de Sanhedrin, chapter 7 of Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin in its later chapter discusses immortality, actually. V'tzarich lomar, and we'd have to say, Dema sheyesh bo chiyuv karet min yud gimel shana, that the fact that one is liable to karet from 13 years old, hu le'inyanim, that has to do with issues she'efshar linhog bizman hazeh. In other words, what he's saying is, what Rambam is saying is that where you might be liable to that punishment of karet has to do with those mitzvahs that can be practiced now. Because there are mitzvot, of course, that cannot be practiced these days, primarily because the temple doesn't exist. And in some cases, it's because Jews weren't living in the land of Israel at the time. They were living there, but they didn't have control over it, right, etc. So there was no sort of Sanhedrin in operation, etc. Okay, so he gives examples. Kagon le halkutor arba'im, right? So, for example, nowadays, right back then, you could get stripes, 40 stripes, okay? Ulefotro mikaret, and in order to exempt him from karet. So there must have been situations where if a person was subjected to physical punishment by the court, he no longer would have to worry about karet. But that doesn't go on anymore. We don't have that situation nowadays. There's no court that is going to do that. Yen lefanenu Parshat Tetzei, ahead in Parshat Tetzei, Ki Tetzei, that's in Deuteronomy, the pasuk in that parsha it talks about administering lashes. Okay, because there it says, do not administer any more than that, lest your brother become abased in your eyes. Okay, or before you really is what it means. But od yesh pratim shonim, and there are other details, various details. Aval guf haonesh, but literally it means the body of this punishment. Einoba doesn't come elal achar isrim shana, but in fact it doesn't apply until after 20 years. So v'yen besefer Nachal Eitan, and check out this book Nachal Eitan. Perek Aleph, chapter 1, Halacha Yud Gimel. Again, this would be subparagraph Yud Gimel, Me'isure Beya. So this is a commentary on the Rambam. One of his chapters in the Mishneh Torah is called Isure Beya, means prohibition of cohabitation, those areas where cohabitation is forbidden. Right? So that's a detail here. So, et briti Heyphar. So why is this karet being administered according to the Torah? It says he has annulled, right, or he has profaned my covenant. Remez, right, so this is an allusion, lemashuch, right? This is, remember that we said a mashuch is someone who was circumcised, but in fact tries to draw the skin over the corona again. Shechayav limol, he is going to have to get recircumcised. This is in Yevamot. So, I mean, I don't believe this is an issue these days, but at one point in that early history, at least around during the time when we were with the Greeks or the Romans under occupation, etc., as I said, the Greeks used to do sports in the nude, and of course, young men, Jewish men, they were mocked for this, and they did, or possibly worse. Okay, so let's take a look. find the place. So we're looking at Mem A. Okay, here we are. Mashuch. So now he's defining this term mashuch. Hu hamahul. This is someone who has been in fact circumcised. Shenim shecha orlato. Right, whose foreskin is drawn out, but kista ha'atara, and it covered the corona. Ukvar katavnu bepasuk hakodem, and we've already written in the earlier verse, the midin Torah, that according to Torah law, right, according to the Torah itself, ein hamashuch chayav b'milah shenit. In fact, someone who has this particular condition is not required to have a second circumcision. V'rak midirabanan. This is considered a rabbinic, a rabbinic law. Mipnei shenir'a ka'arel, and why? Because he looks as if he's uncircumcised. Udrasha zo asmachta v'remes ba'alma, and he's saying, and this interpretation, or this conclusion, is only a support. It is an allusion only. It is not. It's supportive of this concept. It is not a logical deduction. Okay, so let's see. Here we go. The tam hadiyuk, and the reason for looking at it like this, in this way. In other words, let's go back here to look at the word. Okay, okay. So the verse was et briti Heyphar. He has annulled my covenant, right? So he's saying he's looking at that in a particular kind of way, right? Yesh lomar, we could say. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the place. Yeah. Yesh lomar, one could say, de marbe milashon ach, that he goes, in other words, he takes the law and adds another layer to it, right? He makes an addition to the law, an additional aspect to the law, milashon et, because it says et briti, right? It uses this word et. It said et briti Heyphar, right? De bechol makom, because we have on tradition that in every place marbe tafel, that it adds another level to the tafel, I believe, right? Kamo velo yochal et basaro, right? Okay, so make sure I'm reading this correctly. Ukamo velo yochal et basaro, right? I think this is what it's saying, right? It's et basaro. He should not consume its flesh, and we're saying et hatafel basaro. Okay, so marbe here means to include that which is attached to it. Okay, in other words, if it says et something, it's not only the something alone, but something attached, right, to that something. So here we're talking about briti with a covenant of the circumcision. So he's saying something that was attached to it as well, which in this case has to do with the mashuch. But in the case of where it says you shall not eat, right? You shouldn't eat its flesh. In other words, the tafel of asaro, something attached to the flesh, sa'aro, which means we're talking about its hair, the hair of it. Okay. And this is Eruvin Daled Bit, page 4 of Eruvin, the B side. Vahadildul, right? There we go. Okay. So this, I'm sure I'm still dealing with this. Right. Remember we were talking about hadidul shebamashuch, and so we're saying, and that which is sort of hanging from, in the case of mashuch, utafel the basar. So it is attached or it is secondary. That's what tafel essentially means, either attached to or secondary to the meat, the flesh itself. Vayitachen od, and we could say further, mishum da hefer britit, right? That the idea of annulling the covenant. Yomar let's say, again, when I did prepare this, I had this Brit. Oh, no, I'm getting stumped on this particular abbreviation here. Okay. It could be kahachi kamar, but I don't know that it means that. Al habrit shekfar ne'esa. Okay. My apologies for not having this ready, but remember, I'm having to use a different text, not the one that I used originally to prepare this, right? So it's, okay. I'll have to look it up and let you know another time. Okay. So it said regarding a covenant, shekfar ne'esa, right? So, in other words, when we use this concept of annulling the Brit, okay, it's referred to, right, referring to a covenant that was already done for Hanimol, right, and one who is circumcised, Shekfar Shamar et Habrit, right, who's already observed the covenant, that is the circumcision, Hamashuch, who has now drawn that skin over it. In other words, he's actively annulled what he had done. Nikra lefi zeh mafir brit, and for this reason, mafir brit, he is called, according to this, one who is annulled the covenant. So let's see if we want any comments before I go on with this. Okay. And if I need to clarify that, go over it and clarify it further, I will. Okay.
I have a comment.
Yes,
Or
sure.
question.
Thank you. Yes,
Uh,
go
life, as far as I'm understanding, is taking precedence. If a Jewish male, you mentioned being under the regime of, I think it's
Yes.
Greeks, and so
Yes.
if the treatment was worse than mocking, like maybe their lives were in danger,
Correct.
would that
Correct.
justify?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because remember, there were times when studying Torah or practicing Jewish observance was a capital offense. Was
Yeah. So
considered a capital offense.
would that justify trying to hide the fact that the person had been circumcised?
Well, that's why they would do it, in order to avoid being discovered. I mean, that was a reason why people did it. But there are people who did it for, less significant reasons, because if I'm catching what I think you might be implying is that if it's a matter of life or death, would you in fact be excused in this particular case?
Yes.
And the truth is that there are exceptions. There are exceptions to that rule. And I don't know if this is one of those exceptions, but I am aware that it's a general rule of which there are exceptions. By the way, I just thought of what this could mean, and it could mean bechol hakodem, what we just, that abbreviation that I was having difficulty with right here, bechol hakodem, bechol hakodem, meaning when it talks about that on account of having annulled the covenant as a reason, right, is said in all the previous cases where he was talking about it, right? He's saying, I need to tell you that the context that we were talking about, right, is always talking about, when it's talking about annulling the covenant, it wasn't talking in that context about someone who wasn't doing it initially, but somebody who'd had a circumcision, but then tried to annul it. In other words, tried to reverse it. So I'm reasonably confident that this particular abbreviation means bekol hakodem, all the situations earlier, right? Al abrit shikvar ne'esa v'hanimol shikvar shamar et abrit hamashuch, right? So this is, in other words, that's when it's talking about that particular case, right? Okay. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we move on? Thanks, Joss, for that, Jocelyn. Okay. All right, check one more. Et briti Heyphar. Again, it's another Heyphar. He has annulled my covenant or profaned my covenant. L'rabot b'nei Ketura. So this is to include the children of Ketura. So Ketura, of course, was the wife that Abraham took after after Sarah passed away. The Torah says that Abraham married this woman, Ketura. The tradition is that it was in fact Hagar who he took back. Okay, and the truth is that he had 10 more children. If you look, you see that he actually had 10 more children, which means that Abraham ultimately, of course, had 12 children, and from Hagar he had 11. And this is saying that those children also had to, interesting, right? Had to also, Shenit Chayvu Milah, that they too are obligated to practice Milah, circumcision. And I believe, again, it's from this right? Briti. But we'll see. Let's see what Torah Temimah has to say about this. Find the place. Okay. Lo nitpa'er klal, right? It is not clear, it's not made clear any at all. Eifo meruaz chiyuv b'nei keturah, right? Why we're dafka picking on the b'nei keturah b'lashon zeh, right? With this particular expression in the Torah, why dafka we're picking on the b'nei keturah? Yoter mishar hamechuyavim, more than anyone else who might be obligated, right? Why we're saying this particular drush? Velora iti me, and I didn't see anyone sheyasbir bazeh, right? Who could explain regarding this. Af hisber verem iskal, even any slight hint in this verse that we're talking about Bnei Ketura. Why? V'nir eli. So it seems to me, al pi ma shekatuv ba'alei shimush halashon, right? In other words, if we look at grammarians, basically, he's saying how language is used. The hapal Heyphar, right? That this verb Heyphar has annulled or profaned. Yunach al davar. You use that verb in a situation regarding something. Shemetziuto mufar, right? That mitziuto would be its reality, right? Is somehow annulled. For avar min ha'olam, and is no longer in the world at all. La'ad ulamim, ever again. Mibli hishir acharav, without leaving after it, kol zecher u'sha'erit. In other words, nothing's left over. It's totally annulled, right? Totally expunged. That this word Heyphar refers to something like that. Masha eina katuv hapa'al batel. So whereas the enochen, this is not the case if you use the verb batel, right? Batel again means it is batel, it is no longer operating, something like that. Yunach gam al bitul zmani, right? It could be referring to, not a temporary lack of operation or lack of existence, something like that. In which case it might be able to be reparable, in other words, that it could be renewed and returned. The Ein Tosafot Shabbat, he says, take a look at the Tosafot in Tractate Shabbat, page 20b, Divrei Hamatchil Anan. The opening words, the catchphrase for that particular comment is Anan. So he's saying, to summarize here, that this word Heyphar, it means it no longer, he's expunged it, he's exterminated it. Whereas Batel means that he sort of made it inoperable, something like that, batel, right? Vehine, and indeed, Adam Yisrael, that in the case of an Israelite, she'enonimo, that is not circumcised, me'ezu siba shehi, for whatever reason, ifshar lefaresh, you can't say she'im bitulo zeh, right? That in this particular case, where he wasn't able to do it because there was some legitimate external reason why he wasn't able to be circumcised. We've discussed this, right? Possibly he had a couple of brothers who died from the circumcision, or the child was so weak, etc., he could not be circumcised on the 8th day, etc., right? Okay. Hufara kol mitzvat milah ad olam. You can't say that because of that particular situation where the child wasn't circumcised, the very nature of this commandment of circumcision, right, of the Brit Milah, was completely expunged. You can't say that. Ya'an, because ki im hu lo nimo, right? Because I think what he's saying is, even if he is not circumcised, Yimolu Banav, nevertheless, his children would be circumcised, Vidorotav Habaim, and future generations. It's true, he himself has done it, but hasn't been able to be circumcised, but it doesn't mean no longer will he have any connection to circumcision whatsoever, because there's every possibility that if he has children and if he has sons, they will be circumcised. Masha Enokain, this would not be the case of Bnei Ketura. This would not be the case of the children of the descendants of Ketura. Why? Piresh Rashi, right? Rashi explains the sugyan in this particular sugya. This is to say in Sanhedrin, page 59b, right? That's where we see this, right? The chiyuv milotam, that in this case, this particular law, the obligation of their being circumcised, hayta rak be'ela ashisha banim. Okay, I said 12. I was wrong. Okay. So apparently he only had 6 children from Ketura. I'm glad I'm reading this. Forgive me because my knowledge is clearly imperfect, right? It was only Elek Hashisha Banim Amafushrashim Batorah. It only refers to those 6 children who were specified in the Torah at the end of the Parsha of Chayei Sarah. Vetulo, and no more. In other words, what he's saying here is that according to Rashi, when it says they required circumcision, it's only those 6 sons of Abraham. Why? Because Abraham was told to circumcise his offspring, right? And since they were children of his, okay? Klomar, that is to say, shid ledorot lo nitztavu klal zera ketura. In other words, it isn't that in the future generations the seed of Ketura were commanded to do this alamilah regarding circumcision. Ulefize, and according to this, imheim lo yimolu, if they chose not to become circumcised, right? In other words, we're saying clearly that if one of these 6 sons wasn't circumcised, hare heve komo kala v'nit nechritza, right? It would appear meham mitzvat milah olamim. Let me go back and translate this, right? If they didn't, then it was as if the entire mitzvah of milah would be forever expunged, right? Because they were direct seeds of Abraham, and Abraham was commanded to circumcise his seed. But in this particular case, they were not required to circumcise their children. They weren't required according to the mitzvah. So if they themselves chose not to be circumcised, then you're seeing that entire mitzvah doesn't apply at all. Acharei shehem halo lo nimolo, because they themselves weren't circumcised. Im bazadon, im bishkakat, wouldn't matter whether they intended to be uncircumcised or whether they did it, or if they did it because of they weren't aware. Shkaga means ignorance, essentially. Uvenehem acharehem lo nitztavu klal, and the point is that their seed weren't commanded at all to be circumcised. Im kain, and if this is the case, lo tashuv bahem od mitzvat milah lolam. There'd be no reason ever again to practice circumcision for their descendants. V'chilyon nitzchi kazeh, And this complete expunging, right? Be'arnu, we've explained, shekalul b'lashon hafara, that is the implication, right, of this word, of this expression of hafara. And for this reason, Darish et Briti Heyphar, and that's why, going back to that original statement, when it says he has annulled my covenant, Lerabot, that includes Bnei Ketura, the children of Ketura, Shechayavim Limol, that the children of Ketura were obligated to be circumcised. Lomar, in other words, what he's trying to say is, She'im Heim Lo Yimolu, that if they weren't circumcised themselves, Tufar Le'olam Mitzvah Milah, forever would be expunged the commandment of circumcision in their particular case, the dok, and he's saying this is a compelling argument. Now, we have a little bit more here, right here, but I'm not going to take it on today. Next time we come to this, I'll be glad to. And I'm going to stop the share here and just leave a little bit of time, if you'd like, for further comment, if you'd like. So, any further thoughts? Mead, were you thinking about it?
Well, what I've been thinking about is just the application in Second Temple times
Yes.
of how this has evolved into rabbinic law already, pre-Mishnaic, if you will. And, the whole business with the Greeks and the appearance post circumcision, it was always taught to me that this was vanity and a desire to assimilate, not one of survival.
Right.
And that was why the punishment was decreed to be severe. And it was just sort of the way the history was presented, and pretty much from a rabbinic standpoint, that the Jews were busy trying to adopt Greek ways, and this had political and religious ramifications. That's all.
Right. I think that's very helpful because I remember that now. Now that you're jogging my memory, thank you. Yes, that if you say it was for vanity, well, then in that case, this whole application of life or death doesn't apply at all. And for that reason. By the way, I'm not sure I fully understood when you said rabbinic, because the rabbinic period essentially
Pharisaic.
Ezra.
Right, because it wasn't the priests doing this. It was, and the question always in my mind, which will never be resolved, nor among historians, is what about the Sanhedrin? What about who were the sages? And that is practically speaking lost to history. We have later writings, Mishnah and Gemara, referring to this, but it's sort of a mysterious process to me as to how the religious aspects, the civil religious aspects, were governed during that era. That's all.
Right. So, so my thought, honestly, on that subject, is that the rabbinic period, legitimately, you could say, starts with Ezra. Okay.
Okay.
And and again, my theory is that the Torah, as we now currently have it, in the shape and form in which it presently takes, is the result of Ezra's going over the material he had in his hand and his gathering of the scholars of the time and looking at the various manuscripts or whatever they had and being able to put together what he felt was a consistent and helpful version of the Torah. And then again, in trying to maintain and develop the Jewish community, you would have to have scholars and experts to help people understand this, right? And all that for a long, long time was sort of not necessarily written down. That there was something that we could call an oral tradition at the time, and that it was only under emergency situation in the year 200 that it finally got put into written form. Now, we also have the fact that I think there's a tradition that says that Rabbi Akiva possibly kept notes, just sort of little much more brief, briefer notes than the Mishnah represents. Again, the Mishnah represents, sort of the highlights of and the statement of law, not necessarily its rationale, which the Talmud tries to develop. So at least that's, to me, that's my understanding of how this developed, very
Yeah.
much under necessity. But Mead, I think had you not mentioned the vanity issue, it would have escaped me at this time. And I think that really totally, throws into correct light and context what we're talking about here. So
You know, I have some Goyim friends, and they also had circumcision. I said, "Why do you
yeah,
do that?" He says, "For health reasons." He said, "It's
yeah,
so hard to have intercourse with that skin on, and a lot of times you get bacteria in it, and it can cause you a very unhealthy thing. I'd have to go to the doctor." I mean, I said, "Oh, okay. I just was wondering you're a goy, and I didn't understand why you had circumcision."
Well,
Well,
I would have to lean to the medical profession because I think they've been I am familiar with that particular point of view. I've also heard a point of view that says that's really not the case. So
now you can clean yourself.
yeah, yeah,
You don't have to get sick because of your skin being the way you were born.
right.
You
So
can
anyway,
clean it
yeah,
just like you can clean any other little nook
right.
and cranny
Pretty
in your
much.
body.
Pretty much, yes. Agreed. Yeah, the other sort of various,
Same thing with kosher.
yes,
It's not healthier, it just is.
right. I agree. It's a matter of curbing your own desire and your own will to the will of the creator of the universe. It's a way of reinforcing one's belief in a greater power by saying, this is the way I live my life, because there is a greater power. So with this, I'm going to stop the recording, if I can. Okay.